Okay, so maybe we should start now. Well, welcome everyone to the Contemporary China Research Cluster organized by the Faculty of Social Sciences. And so today we are very happy to have to invite Professor Edmund Terence Gomez and also his team to discuss with us a very, very interesting and also a very important topic on the China investment in Malaysia. I think we read a lot on the newspaper, but we know little about the details. And of course, we would really want to know how does it relate to the contemporary China and how does it relate to the Asian countries. And so we are very happy to have Professor Gomez with us and his team with us today to discuss about the topic. So let me first introduce Professor Gomez to every one of you. I guess some of you may be quite familiar with his work, but please bear with me that to introduce the details for those who not knowing him in details. So Professor Edmund Terence Gomez is a professor of political economy at the Faculty of Economics and Administration at the University of Malaya, and his specialty is mainly on state market relations and the linkage between politics, policy, and enterprise development. And he has held various appointments, including the appointment at the University of Leeds in UK and Murdoch University in Australia. Between year 2005 and 2008, he served as a research coordinator at the United Nations Research Institute for Social Development in Geneva, Switzerland. And Professor Gomez is a prolific writer, and he published a number of books, including in year 1997, he published a book by Cambridge University Press on Malaysia political economy, and in 2002, political business in East Asia, 2004, the state of Malaysia, ethnicity, equity, and reform, and then in 2012, the politics of resource extraction, and then 2013, another book on new economic policy in Malaysia, 2017, about the also is about the Ministry of Finance Incorporated ownership and control of corporate Malaysia. So really, really a very prolific writer. And if you want to know about the Malaysian political economy, I guess Professor Gomez is the person that we should talk to. And today we are very happy that we also have the chance to meet with his team, including Professor Su Yang Tam, is a visiting senior fellow at ISEAS Yusof ISCA at Singapore. And Professor Tam is also a professor emeritus at University campus in Malaysia. And also the other research team member is Dr. Randy, senior lecturer at Institute of China Study at the University of Malaya. And finally, Dr. Ki Chak Chung is senior advisor at Asia Europe Institute, University of Malaya. So we have a group of distinguished scholars to be with us today, discuss about the China investment in Malaysia. So without further ado, so let me pass the time to Professor Gomez.
Thank you.
Sorry, I can't get my video.
Oh, that's all right, Kicho.
Yes.
As long as we can hear you, that's fine.
Yeah.
That's fine.
I can sign out, I think.
That's fine. Don't worry, Kicho. First, let me start by thanking.
Okay.
Let me start by thanking Professor Eric Fong for inviting. Oh, thank you. Let me start by thanking Professor Eric Fong for inviting us to present this seminar on this book that we recently published. This is the first study of China's investments in Malaysia. So in many ways, it's opening up space for, I feel, further research also in other countries. What I'm hoping to do today is that we will present our research findings on Malaysia. I must stress that our research is only focusing on Malaysia so far. I hope that after this seminar that we can possibly get some collaborative work going to try and see whether we can get research of a similar sort in other countries in Southeast Asia. So let me first start by sharing the slides. Let me take you through this. Can you see the slides, Eric? Can you all see the slides? Eric, is it all right?
Yes, we can see very well.
So today's focus, as I said, is on China and Malaysia, and our specific focus is on state-business relations and how they have been forged as China moved into Southeast Asia and Malaysia specifically. In 2013, Xi Jinping introduced his Belt Road Initiative. When he introduced the BRI, what also occurred in Malaysia was there was an opening up of space to draw foreign direct investments from around the world. This was also important for Malaysia because at that time, the Malaysian government was not getting sufficient domestic investments, mainly because of the political crisis in the country. So there was a certain confluence of interesting events. The BRI was initiated and Malaysia was looking for foreign direct investments. When the BRI was introduced, there was a surge of investments from China into Southeast Asia. Malaysia was one of the largest recipients of these investments. But what was most interesting about these investment flows was this: a new form of state-business relation was being forged. What we were seeing here now was the presence of two strong states, one in China and the other in Malaysia, led by formidable leaders where a lot of power was concentrated in the office of the executive arm of government. These two state leaders forged what we call state-state ties. Two strong men in politics talking to each other, both with a specific agenda, one on the BRI, the other to draw in investments to sustain the economy, discussing how to allow for these investments to flow into Malaysia. What was also interesting in this new phenomenon of state-state ties is this: China's economy, if you look at it, if you look at the corporate sector, the predominant actor are state-owned enterprises. If you look at Malaysia, the predominant actor in the corporate sector are what we call GLCs, government-linked companies, or state-owned enterprises by another name. If you look at the top 10 companies in Malaysia, 8 of them are GLCs, government-linked companies. So we are dealing here with two states, two strongmen, who also have control over major enterprises in their respective countries. So what we were seeing now was state-state ties leading to state-owned enterprises working with other state-owned enterprises to mount projects. Where did private investors fit in this new phenomenon? It is not to say they were completely left out of the frame. That is not true. The Malaysian government was also looking for investments from other countries, including from private investors. But the dominant force now, the new trend that was emerging, was one of state-state ties involving state-owned enterprises from both countries. What this meant was we were now seeing a sea change in terms of state-business relations. If before, when we looked at state-business relations, we talked about public-private partnerships. The public-private partnership would be one where the public is the government, of course, and the private sector would normally be multinational firms. These multinational firms would be the dominant force, the power. The power was with the multinational companies, which could enter into emerging economies and even dictate the agenda with regards to the terms on which they enter this economy. This was now changing. Now what we were seeing was not public-private partnerships, we were seeing public-public partnerships. It was this diversity of public-public partnerships that we wanted to capture in Malaysia. Let me remind you that this phenomenon that we're talking about prevails in other countries in Southeast Asia too. You will see it happening in Vietnam. You will see it also happening in countries such as Singapore, where the state is very dominant. You will see it definitely in Indonesia, which also has state-owned enterprises. And you will also see it in other forms in the Philippines. But let me take you first through this issue of state-business relations. Theoretically, what does it look like in the literature? In the literature, when they talk about state-business relations, they basically talk about public-private partnerships, an emerging economy with a weak state where they are subservient to multinational firms from abroad, which are powerful because of the investments they can bring and the technological know-how that they have. In these kinds of state-business relations, the literature will tell you, we have three types of hands. The first is what they call the invisible hand. The invisible hand means that the government will create public policies and incentives to draw investments. After all, they got to compete with a number of other countries to draw these investments from multinational firms. So they create policies which will provide incentives to ensure that multinational firms come to their country. So the state's role here is to provide these kinds of incentives to draw FDI. The second one, which the literature talks about, is what we call the helping hand. The helping hand here is where the government intervenes to support private firms. So this is quite common in Southeast Asia. In Southeast Asia, one common trend is the presence of a highly interventionist state. The state intervenes in the economy to support domestic firms, to nurture them, to create infant industries in particular sectors so that they become major players in the economy. They have industrial policies to pursue this agenda. And so here, the state helps private firms to emerge as major players in the economy. The third hand, which the literature talks about, is what we call the grabbing hand. Here, what we are seeing is basically rent-seeking activities, corruption, patronage, also very pervasive in Southeast Asia. Grabbing hand tendencies prevail when the government issues contracts for major projects, usually done in collaboration with a foreign firm, especially for major projects. So that's on the different types of hands or models that exist in the state business relations. We are not going to throw away these different hands. In fact, we continue to use these theoretical ideas when we analyze the different types of state business relations when China's state-owned enterprises entered Malaysia. But there's another dimension that we need to talk about, which is very different, where the theorizing begins to change. When you look at the literature on state business relations, public-private partnerships, they talk about structural power. Where does the power lie? And the power normally lies with the big businesses. These are the capital controllers. They can exert, as I said, much power over emerging economies to decide if they should invest. So they dictate the terms of entry into a country. And these governments normally have little control over these companies. Structural power is with the multinational firms. The second point, which we should pay attention to in the literature, is about the institutional architecture. I said earlier, the government will create public policies to draw investments. It works within an institutional architecture. What does that architecture look like? And in this architecture, too, where does the power lie? Now, again, here, we don't throw away these concepts when we theorize about China's investments in Malaysia. But what we do is we question now, has there been a shift in structural power? If firms coming into the country now are dictated along state-state terms, and if they are controlled by the state, so if you have state-owned enterprises controlled by powerful politicians who control the state, dictating the entry conditions into an economy, where does the structural power lie? Who makes the decisions in this particular context? Second, when they enter into the economy, what kind of institutional architecture prevails to allow for the flow of these investments? Because the way in which they now enter into the economy, the way in which they are now operationalized changes. From public-private, now we have public-public. Who dictates where they invest? Who dictates who works with these firms from China? Who dictates which sectors that they go into? These are interesting new dimensions now that we need to understand with this changing phenomenon that we are seeing in Southeast Asia. Here again, when we look at this new phenomenon, the actors now are different. If before we talked about privately owned multinational firms, now we are talking about state-owned enterprises and GLCs. If one key new phenomenon that we are now discussing is state-state, two governments, two leaders of governments dictating the agenda for investments. The whole scenario is changing in terms of who dictates how the investments flow inwards and outwards from a country. In terms of state-state ties, if you look at the literature will always tell you there's a contestation going on between big businesses and the states. States are not happy with the conditions which are imposed on them by multinational firms. But here, since it's two government leaders deciding how to invest and where to invest, you don't see much clashes. The governments will shape the entry and execution of these projects. Private investors now are on bended knee. If they hope to get into this project, they have to appeal to the states to get in. Here you're seeing again, as I said, a major shift in power play. Private firms now, multinational firms, I can tell you from our research, are complaining that they no longer have the influence that they used to have in the Malaysian economy. Here I'm talking about firms from North America as well as from Europe. They're all lamenting the fact that now the power lies with the state and with the state-owned enterprises, and they can't seem to be able to break into this nexus, state-state nexus that has now been created. A third point, which is very interesting, we have to look at this very carefully, is about financial industrial links. Who is financing these massive industrial projects? Here again, you'll see the role of the state. The state controls these financial institutions. So here we are not looking at privately owned financial institutions funding industrial projects. Here we are looking at the states dictating the industrial project and the state even financing it because they control the banks that have the money to finance them. Again, a whole new phenomenon is being created in the way in which investments flow into this country and how they're executed. Now, I want to talk about the diversity. When I talk about the state-business relations, I'm not talking here about a homogeneous form of state-business relation. Here you can see in this pie chart, I'm showing you the different types of state-business relations that we uncovered. We did a study of these investments. We found about 92 projects, and then we did a detailed breakdown of the nature of the state-business ties. The first one, state-state. State-state means state-owned enterprises from two countries working together, a huge segment of the pie. Another one is state-state private. So Chinese state, Malaysian state with a Malaysian private. And then we have state private private, Malaysian state, Chinese state with a foreign private firm. Not much of that, only one in fact we could find. And then we find a bulk of them, state private, Chinese state with Malaysian private, and Malaysian state with Chinese private firms. And then private private, that means private firms from Malaysia with privately owned firms from China. And 30% Chinese firms from China, of which we have Chinese state-owned enterprises, Chinese private-owned enterprises, and a mixture of both. So you can see here diverse forms of state-business relations. In terms of where did they invest in? Now this is very interesting because here we are giving you the sectoral breakdown. If you look at the sectoral breakdown, what you will find, which is very interesting, is about a third of them are in productive sectors of the economy. Industrial and manufacturing, as you can see here, 35 of the 92 firms are in the industrial sector. You will find another 20 are in infrastructure. Infrastructure broadly defined. This can also be dams, it can be power supply, it can be telecommunications. So in here, if you look at infrastructure and industrial sector, 55 of more than half of these firms are in very productive segments of the corporate sector of the economy. And here also you can see in terms of the breakdown, what is also very interesting, look at the last one, Chinese firms only, state-owned enterprises and private firms. 20 of them are in the industrial sector, again showing a rather productive dimension. They're coming in here and they're working in the industrial sector, in manufacturing, very productive. And also a large segment of the companies are privately owned firms too. If you look at state-state, they are primarily in industrial and in industrial sector and infrastructure, to be expected, because state-state ties are usually to finance very, very expensive projects, industrial projects as well as infrastructure projects. Here I'm giving you a map of Peninsular Malaysia. I'm not showing you the Borneo states of Sabah and Sarawak, but here this map gives you an idea of the different types of the spatial differences, if you like. They do not invest only in one area, they invest throughout the peninsula. And as you can see here, the types of sectors that we are pointing out to are also, as I said, solar technology, creating parts for the railway line industry, the East Coast railway line, high-speed rails have been created, the Kuantan port was created, an industrial park was also created in the state of Pahang. In Malacca, we have a massive port mixed development project, the Malacca Port Project, and in Johor, we have also textile. You can see here the diverse forms of investments, the diversity of sectors that they have gone into. Let me stop here and let me now bring in Professor Tham, who will now take you through the case studies. We are now going to go on to the case studies and the lessons learned from these case studies. Professor Tam?
Thank you very much, Professor Gomez. In the book, we have covered 7 detailed case studies, and we summarize these case studies according to the key variables as shown in this table, so that we can have some comparisons. The key variables that we are looking at are financial industrial linkages, the institutional architecture. These 2 variables come from the theoretical framework that was explained by Professor Gomez. We also look at the outcome of the projects, including the expected ones, and we look at its impact in the 4th column on Malaysia's enterprise and economic development objectives. I need to emphasize that the 4th column is our assessment on its impact on Malaysia's long-term development. It's not the same as the 3rd column, because the outcomes of the project are sometimes we discuss it in terms of the objectives of the project, what each project aims to achieve. And then we look at the overall impact based on the theoretical framework as explained by Professor Gomez, as to whether in the end the state is a helping hand or a grabbing hand. In the 7 cases that we have, we actually have different forms of partnerships. We have 3 cases, Alliance Steel, CRCC, this is the rail transport equipment, and DNY textile production, whereby there is no Malaysian partner involved. These are all companies from China which are operating in Malaysia. So they have different forms of, they are not necessarily all state enterprises. Alliance Steel, for example, has a partnership between SOE and a Chinese enterprise in China. CRCC is a state-owned enterprise, subsidiary of a state-owned enterprise operating in Malaysia. And DNY Textile is a private enterprise, but was first established as a state enterprise years ago. And we can see that they all have different forms of linkages. The financing is all from China, except in this case, there was some local financing for land acquisition. In terms of the institutional architecture, we can see that it's a bit, there are varieties of it. Different projects have different institutional architecture, but the outcomes have some similarity, because all these projects have brought in foreign direct investment into the country and created employment. Of course, Chinese workers have also come in. There are also Malaysian workers. In terms of the immediate impact, we can see that all these projects have training going on for the Malaysian workers. So in that sense, there is technology transfer. However, there's a large technology gap between these firms and the local firms which are producing, for example, steel in Malaysia. And therefore, there's a big technology gap. And in terms of long-term technology transfer, it remains to be seen. We also know that all these projects have some form of export orientation. So they are exported and they earn some foreign exchange for Malaysia. But for the long-term development, as to whether it will facilitate industrial upgrading, technology transfer to the small and medium enterprises in Malaysia, that remains to be seen because of the technology gap, because of the scale gap between these firms and the local enterprises. Overall, the state is a helping hand in all these. We do see a grabbing hand in this case because of the negotiated contracts. Terence, next slide, please. We have also the case of Jinko, whereby we can see the state facilitating, the state, Penang state stepping in, the chief minister facilitating the investment to come in quickly, and for the company, the factory, the solar factory to be built and running within 6 months. So we can see also in this case, there's FDI and employment, there are exports. Again, long-term impact in terms of local sourcing and helping local enterprises to access the technology to grow remains unknown because the extent of local sourcing is not known. In this case, we can see the state as a helping hand. In the digital free trade zone, phase 2, we see collaboration between the Malaysian state, the GLC, and China, which is a private firm, the logistic arm of Alibaba. So in this case, we can also see that there's FDI and employment, but the objective of the collaboration is very much profit-centered rather than development-centered. Next slide, please. So in the last 2 cases we look at Proton and Geely's investment in Proton, whereby is a private collaboration, private Chinese firm and a private firm in Malaysia. In the case of Malaysia-China Kuantan Industrial Park, we have a Malaysian GLC collaborating with the SOE from China, Beibu. So we do have different partnerships, and the funding also varies depending on the partnership. The local partners have, in this case, access domestic loans. The foreign partner, Geely, they have access their own funds from China. The outcomes of the project in these cases are very much profit-driven. So even though there's FDI and employment, and there's the aim to capture both local and foreign markets, the long-term impact in terms of industrial upgrading, being able to develop the SMEs, the local vendors to be able to move up the value chain, that also remains to be seen. So likewise, in MCKIP, we can also see FDI, employment and training. Again, long-term technology transfer is not known. In all these cases, the state helps, facilitates, and we see the helping hand. In all these, there is no grabbing hand because these are very much private ventures. In this case, the partner is a locally listed company. So these are all the 7 cases that we have covered in the book. Be happy to take on more questions later.
Thank you, Suyen. Kicho?
Yes. I think let me take you through with the lessons that I learned from these 7 cases. First of all, it's the role of the state is central to everything. Centrality of politics is vital because out of the many types of state business relationship, at least 3 are state and state, state and state, state private, and the state private. 3 types. Now, interestingly, Malaysia has actually gone through elections. So the 2 things that are important for the state. First, it is not static. You know, as we saw, there was a change in government, and therefore a change of cast of characters. Therefore, it has changed. But however, it's just a change of cast of characters, but they have not changed. It's just a different group of people, you know, nothing much has changed, you know. But as related to the state and business, it is not very clear because there are different types of relationships between the state and business, you know. So for state, 2 governments can actually together decide how they should function, you know, without the private sector. Okay. And in the industrial sector, we find that the firms are basically provided a helping hand, but it can be captured by private interests. When it comes to investments, we look at state, and state-private. We look at progression of state involvement and private involvement at the other end. It is clear that the more the state is involved, political elites dominate the decision making. So, but when it comes down to the other end of private and China firms, it's more a question of sound business decision making. Now, in terms of structural power, the traditional mode is actually for an MNC to have to control the capital and decide where to invest. But the state itself will provide incentives for them to draw them to invest. However, in these present circumstances, everything's been changed. The two states are sovereign, and therefore they can do all kinds of things among themselves without the private sector. Okay. And as we see from the Siu Yan's presentation, the key actors differ. They're quite different. You know, you have some projects in which the Malaysian state has very little say. It just facilitates the entry of Chinese investment. In the case of Proton, the Malaysian government had a very strong say, but eventually relinquished ownership. So the different cast of characters at play. In terms of sectors, you will notice that in the industrial and manufacturing sectors, there's more equal power relationship, because even the Chinese are interested are anxious to make the SOEs work efficiently, generate employment, industrial development, create new jobs, and therefore provide a helping hand. Next one, please. Okay. Now, in terms of Malaysia, you will notice that in terms of policy direction, it is very unclear. You know, the project is, in some cases, the Malaysian authorities only provide facilitation. You know, like in Jinko, like MCKIP and all that. You know, and in some cases, basically the two governments get together, CRRC get together and decide on whatever to do themselves. So there's no clear direction in the policy. Secondly, there's a question of industrial architecture, institutional. Again, it is not very clear. You know, there's a variety of different institutions involved. You know, in terms of sectors, I think there's some targeting of high-tech sectors. You know, the role of DFTC. You know, the role of Alibaba, and then even in terms of DNY, the textile and Alliance Steel, they are using very high technology. So the only problem is Malaysia is not well equipped in terms of human capital to capture that technology. So it basically lacks, all it can do is to make use of Chinese technology, you know. Then in terms of political leadership, now, Malaysian government is highly centralized. It is said that Malaysia is actually a unitary state disguised as a federation. So therefore, the federal government has very, very strong power to control the decision making on FDIs and all that. And because of that, very often, you know, even though the projects are located in states, in the states, the states don't get much of a say in the only case where the states work with the federal government was with Jinko in Penang. Now, because of the centralization, coordination is very, very, very limited between federal and local government, and also in any case, there's no transparency. That's what they want to do. That's about it. Terence, back to you.
Thank you. So that brings me now to the conclusion. The first point which I want to stress is this: what we are showing you here is honestly the first attempt to try and quantify and assess this type of state-business relationship that we are seeing now evolving in the region. As I said at the beginning of my presentation, there's been no assessment of these kinds of state-state ties and the implications that they're having. Now, why this is important is, as you can see just from the 7 case studies, and we just showed you 7 case studies, you can already see a diverse form of state-business relations. Where does the power lie in each of these different 7 case studies varies significantly. It depends on the nature of the investment. It depends also on who has the technological know-how. If the government invites a particular company like Alibaba to set up the digital free trade zone, the government now is like the state business theoretical literature of the past, of old, where Alibaba is the powerful force dictating the terms of entry to set up the digital free trade zone, and the Malaysian government is subservient to Alibaba. But in other cases, that is not the case. In state-state, as Kichok pointed out, 2 governments decide, they do it in a non-transparent way, they bring in the investments, they dictate the terms to the SOEs to get it implemented the way they want it done. A diverse form of SPR is occurring in this country. And what does this mean in terms of outcomes? The outcomes also therefore vary. If you have different types of state-business relations, you also have different types of outcomes. As we have shown here, in the industrial sector, the outcomes have been quite good. In terms of developing particular sectors of the economy, they have done well. The Malaysian car project, which was ailing, Geely comes in, Geely takes over Proton, and today the Proton car project is again a success story. It's doing very well. So we can have productive outcomes. So the question then arises, looking at this, can the state-led SBRs be effective? Our answer is yes, it can. In spite of the problems that we have talked about, we have seen from our case studies, and that's what makes this project so interesting, we have seen very productive outcomes. What does it also show? As I said at the beginning of this talk, the nature of the state, the nature of development in Southeast Asia has been one where the state intervenes directly in the economy in a big way. That is true of Singapore, Indonesia, Malaysia, Thailand. Now, here we are seeing a different form of intervention by the state. And here we are seeing the state also intervening using their GLCs or state-owned enterprises. Here you can see authoritative policy-driven allocation, the state dictating the way in which the rents are to be distributed. The state is also dictating creation of new industries, helping small and medium-scale enterprises. The rhetoric is there, but what is interesting also is where we have concerns is, are the outcomes necessarily good for Malaysia in the long run? In terms of the helping hand, creating supply chains, bringing Malaysian SMEs into the supply chains, creating firm capabilities, we saw that. The case studies do indicate that. But in terms of knowledge spillovers, yes, that is occurring, but the problem could also not be on China's side, it's on our side. We just don't have the technological capacity to absorb all this. We don't have the human capital to absorb this kind of technological lessons that we are being exposed to. In terms of R&D, which is very important, if you want an economy to grow, you want to have technological upgrading, R&D is very important. They are providing that kind of R&D. They are undertaking risky ventures, and they are being undertaken by companies that have the competency to do it. These are good things. So what are our key takeaways? If you look at SBRs within and between, you will find, as I said, you have to go and look at them on a case-by-case basis, project-by-project basis. In some projects, especially the major infrastructure projects like the railway lines, there are major political issues at play. politicians are the key actors here dictating how the projects should be implemented. For more industrial type projects, you will find that the politicians are not very involved. It's economic actors, the owners of companies dictating the agenda. So when you look at the SBRs, you have to look at them carefully to see what are the outcomes, because who controls them, where does the power lie in each SBR tends to differ. The other point which I want to close on is this. Although there are productive outcomes, as I mentioned earlier, in the short term, the productive outcomes seem to be beneficial for the economy. The economy is growing. We need these investments. They're going to key sectors of the economy Malaysia wants to develop. However, our conclusion is this: we are worried about the long-term implications. What are the long-term implications of Malaysia's growing subservience to Chinese investments in this country? Are these Chinese investments of the sort that nurture domestic enterprises? We are not seeing much of that occurring. Domestic Malaysian enterprises. Are these long-term investments leading to the creation of viable independent Malaysian firms that can also compete with these Chinese firms? We are not seeing that either. What does this mean then? If Malaysian firms cannot compete with the Chinese firms that are now entering in a big way into the Malaysian economy, are the long-term implications that China will now become a key economic actor in the Malaysian economy, with the Malaysian government subservient to Chinese investments in this country? Thank you. Eric, back to you.
Thank you so much, our Malaysian team. And for your information, we are recording the whole event. And I guess many of us, read about the China investment in Asia, especially in the ASEAN country. But I guess this is the first time, at least for myself, to learn about the details and also a thorough analysis of the investment in ASEAN country. I'm sure that every one of us, or many of us, will have questions. So I encourage you to ask the question to the team. There are two ways you can ask the question. Either you use the chat box, you write down your question, and the team will answer your question, or you can unmute yourself and ask the question directly. All right, so maybe I would like to start myself to ask a question. So from what you discussed, I just wondering, how are you going to classify this type of economy? Are you considered it as a market economy, or is a planned economy? It sounds like neither of them.
I would classify it as a mixed economy. It's not, like I said, private firms are not brought into the frame at all. In fact, they are. It's not like the Malaysian government doesn't want investments from Europe and from North America or from other Japan, or for that matter, Singapore. In fact, the volume of investments from these countries into Malaysia is also quite high. Many of these companies coming in are privately owned multinationals of great repute too. The question, however, is the growing influence of Chinese investments in this country. And the growing influence of Chinese investments, when they do come in, who are the key actors? It's state-owned enterprises, a different type of company. Our focus really is on ownership and control of companies. Who owns and controls these companies? In multinational firms, there's a huge literature on that. I needn't get into it. But when it comes to state-owned enterprises, it's owned by the Chinese state. So the Chinese state dictates the entry point and controls the SOEs. But I would like to make this point too, Eric. We are finding that privately owned Chinese firms are also quite subservient to the Chinese state. So they may be big companies like Huawei or Alibaba, but there's also a question of how much influence does the Chinese state have even over these huge privately owned firms. That's why if you want to talk about the classification type of economy, even when we say it's a market driven, it's a mix. Again, there are nuances here that we need to get into. And that can only be done by doing a proper analysis of each firm.
Thank you. Any questions?
Let me add a little bit to it. Terence talked about a mixed system. Actually, even some non-state enterprises that invested, like Alliance Steel, like DNY, were formerly state enterprises. So it is very hard to make a distinction between private and public among the Chinese enterprises.
It comes back to the nature of the enterprise, Eric, as we were saying just now. With the state intervening and the state such a powerful actor, who controls these companies too? We can take other questions now.
Any question from our audience? If not, then because I find the topic is very interesting. If not, then we answer another question. We have been talking about I would say that from the organizational perspective, from the firm perspective. So how the local people will all this investment in China.
Before I answer, would one of my colleagues like to take this on? How is society responding to investment? Anyone? Okay, so let me take it on then. First, Eric, let me say this. We haven't done any research to see the sentiment on the ground among members of society in terms of how they are reacting to this. So that's why, as you can see, none of us were ready to come out with a response to your question. We haven't done research on that particular aspect. We've only been looking at it from the perspective of the firm itself, and we've been looking at it from the perspective of the state. But having said that, my guess is, from talking to SMEs in particular, is that they're very worried about the power of these Chinese firms. They're financially very powerful, and they also have technological know-how. I'm particularly worried about the SMEs because the SMEs cannot compete with these firms. And even if they do get into the supply chains, the feedback I'm getting from small and medium-scale enterprise owners is this: it is better they are being bought over by these companies from China, and they're selling out. And when I asked some of them, why are you selling out? They said, why do they even want to buy you? So they said, the reason for doing that is because these SMEs are already part of supply chains. Buying into these companies, they immediately get into the supply chain. They become part of the supply chain. Now, this is worrisome because that means by just taking over firms in Malaysia, they can already get access to the supply network, the production network, and thereby become an even more powerful force and become even more embedded in the Malaysian economy. Now, the implications of this also, again, are serious. But as I said, we haven't done enough research from that perspective to test these sentiments that we are getting from the ground, from companies, in terms of their response to Chinese investments in the country.
Yeah.
Can I just add something?
Yes, please.
Yeah, when you raise the question as to the reception from the public, the society, actually, there have, as far as I can recall, there has been just one study that was done whereby this is a university project that conducted a survey of the public, the society at large, on their perceptions of Chinese investment at the Malaysia-China Industrial Park. And they went out and they did a survey, and they asked basically the people living in the city near the park, Kuantan, as to how their views are on the park and their views on the presence of Chinese, increasing presence of Chinese in the city in terms of the workers. And I would say that based on the survey response, it would appear that we in Malaysia does not have strong anti-Chinese sentiments that you see expressed, for example, in Indonesia towards they have strong anti-Chinese sentiments towards, for example, the presence of Chinese workers. I think here the local community, the shop houses and all that, see some gain in terms of the Chinese workers patronizing, say, small Chinese restaurants and small small shops. There is there is limited interactions because the Chinese workers live in the factory and they only come out intermittently. So there is limited interaction, but I would say there's no strong anti-Chinese sentiment.
Thank you.
I also want to say something.
Yes, please.
Okay, I want to say something about the local enterprises. Actually, I think they are quite keen to benefit from China's investment in Malaysia. But however, actually, China's investment in Malaysia, they are quite dominant actually, and the local enterprises may not benefit so much from the investment. For example, the CRC, which is a Chinese train manufacturer, it has a very big investment in Malaysia, and this company actually in Malaysia, it do train the local supplier, local enterprises to make the components of the train for this company. But those parts, those components actually are not that core. They are just the not very important ones. For example, the train seats or the air con of the train. So those local enterprises cannot manufacture the core parts of the train. Not because this CRC, Chinese company, does not want to let them to manufacture, but they can't. The local enterprises can't. They don't have the core technology to manufacturing the core parts of the train. So yeah, that's one of the thing I want to add.
Thank you. Any questions from our audience? It seems that we have a very quiet audience. Okay, someone types Milton Lim, and he typed that question: what can the Chinese do to allay fears about China investment in Malaysia? So anyone would like to answer the question?
I'm not sure how to approach this question. But anyone, Suyen or Kichok or Ren?
Yeah, I have one comment. I think that greater transparency would be very good. I find that in the case of the Malaysia-China Industrial Park, that they were, because the construction of the factory and what the factory is doing in the community and for the community is actually not communicated. Technically, when we have a project, you should do an environmental impact assessment whereby you actually have feedback from the public. But I think because all these are not made known to the public, so there's a lot of miscommunication and misperception as to what the factory is doing in the country. So therefore, when they built the wall surrounding the factory, which is very normal, you know, how many factories do you see operating without a wall? All factories have a wall surrounding the factory to protect the assets of the factories, especially when under construction. but they built the wall, and the wall was higher than usual. There's a construction limit on the height of the wall, and I think this exceeded it. And because of that, the wall was perceived to be akin to the Great Wall of China. So it appeared in the media that China is constructing a Great Wall here. So it's about being able to explain to the public what you are doing and being transparent about what you are doing. When there's lack of transparency, for example, I'm looking at the hydropower projects. When the state is going on a mega project, of course it has great impact on society, and it needs clear explanation as to why the state has agreed to have the project and what are the benefits it can bring to the country. But because there's no transparency, because there's poor communication, I find that there's a lot of misunderstanding and misperception as to what the project is doing in the country.
Can I come in now to add on to what Xu Yan has just mentioned?
Yes.
Xu Yan's point is noteworthy because as you can see from the 7 case studies, we showed that there were productive outcomes. Now, one of the reasons why we focused on the industrial sector is because we wanted to show that there were productive outcomes from the investments in the industrial sector. However, if you look at the public domain, much of the focus is on the large-scale infrastructure project. The East Coast railway line was a major controversy in this country with serious allegations of corruption. The Malacca port, the Malacca Gateway, was a major project which ran aground. It contributed to environmental degradation, and there was a lot of political business nexuses which were of the questionable sort. And then we had what is known as the Forest City, a major residential cum industrial park in the south of the peninsula, right next to Singapore. Again, very controversial because it involved power elites from Malaysia with very powerful businessmen from China. It is these projects that get the most publicity in this country. And that is why there's a lot of negative sentiments also about Chinese investments in Malaysia. But there is another side to the story, which is what the book we captured in the book. There's also this productive side. But these stories about the solar technology, the textile industries, what's happening there, it's not coming out. It's not out much in the public domain. So we are trying to bring a balanced picture also here to the investments that are coming in. But how do we ensure productive investments of the sort that we wrote about occurs and not the negative sorts, the corruption type, the environmental degradation type projects occur? This is where we come back to the institutional architecture, the role of the state. And here I agree totally with Xu Yan. Transparency, credibility, these are the things that must be brought to the fore. The state must also be independent when vetting the investments coming in. The state must ensure it goes into projects that are truly productive, that these kinds of non-productive, corrupt type projects do not occur. And that's where we also, when we talk about this, talked about the need for an institutional architecture which is truly open and accountable. Then we can really have more positive outcomes from Chinese investments in the country.
Thank you. So we have 3 more questions, and maybe we can address them one by one. So the next one, the question is that, are there any government policies currently in place to monitor or control foreign investment from gaining too much influence within the Malaysian economy?
Xu Yan?
Yeah, in terms of foreign direct investment, all approval for foreign direct investment has to go through the National Committee on Investment. That's at the high level, chaired by the Prime Minister, the Minister of Trade, and the Minister of Finance. So the investment approval is at that level, and the investment approval is not based on country. It is based on project. So that means it is not a question as to favoring Chinese investment. It is a question as to whether the investment meets the development or the investment targets of the country. So I would say that in terms of approval, there is no bias. Of course, in terms of the number of projects which have applied for approval, it is possible that because there's no data, it is possible that there are more Chinese investments applying for approval than from other countries. And therefore, we can end up with an outcome that there are more Chinese investments. But from the state's point of view, from the approval process, there's no bias towards Chinese investment.
I think I need to make a small comment. You know, the Chinese investments are coming in at a time when all the other countries' investments are leaving town. So Malaysia is quite desperate for new Chinese investments at that time. There are large outflows of FDI from other countries at that time.
I see. So the next question we have is that for the Chinese investment in Malaysia, what are the sources of profit? Is this from Malaysia or from export to other parts of the world?
Liren or Suyen, would you like to take this, because this will come out from the case studies?
The Chinese investments in Malaysia in the manufacturing sector, as well as in the services, are twofold. One, they do sell to the domestic economy. Even when they are export oriented, as in the case of Alliance Steel, even when there are export conditions, they are still allowed to sell to the domestic economy. So there is, if you ask where are the sources of revenue, then there are domestic sales. But because Malaysia is a relatively small economy compared to, say, Indonesia or Thailand or Vietnam, inevitably, the domestic market is not the most attractive factor if we are to compare Malaysia to, say, the other countries in Southeast Asia that Chinese investment can go to. So therefore, in the case of Malaysia, even when it's efficiency-seeking investment, there is an export element. There is an export element in the sense that, for example, the Chinese investment do want to come in and use Malaysia as an export platform to other countries, especially in the region. So if we look, for example, at Geely's investment, it is not just for the domestic market alone, which is already quite saturated. So there's this idea because the car market in ASEAN is very much Japanese controlled. So therefore there is this idea that the entry into the Malaysian market will be used as a platform to export to the other countries in the region as well. So I would say therefore two sources are domestic as well as export.
Yeah, especially for some field, for example, the steel sector, I think Malaysia has a relatively big market because it has very much potential of the infrastructure. So the infrastructure-driven demand is will be in Malaysia. And secondly, I think some countries for China, there is a kind of tax barrier. So maybe they don't have the tax barrier for Malaysia. So Malaysia can be a third country for China to export those products.
Well, because of the time limit, I think we are going to take this last question that someone, Fang Yung, that put in the chat box. The question is that, is there any research on gender impacts of China's investment, such as on gender norms, gender difference of employment opportunity, and salary?
I don't think so.
Yeah. I haven't come across that from my own research, but my research has been more on the state business relations. But even in the case studies that I've looked at, I haven't seen any research of this sort. But let me ask the others in my team, maybe they know. Liren, what do you think?
I think for heavy industry, they do have more male workers than the female ones. The heavy industry, yes. For others, I don't know. Service sector, Prof. Tan? Well, how about the service sector?
What I meant is I don't think there has been any substantial study looking at gender issues.
Yes.
In general, not just in Malaysia, in general, if we look at Chinese investment, I don't think at least I have not read any significant study looking at gender issues.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, because of the time, I guess we have to stop here. I'm sure that some of us still may have some other questions. But anyhow, I guess we learned a lot from the discussion, especially about the Chinese investment in Malaysia, and I think it's open a window for us to understand about the China investment in ASEAN country as well. So before we start the discussion earlier today, I talked with the team, and then Professor Gomez mentioned to me that the number of cases, COVID-19 confirmed cases, seems to be increased in Malaysia, and they are about to lock down the city. So we really wish you, the whole team, stay safe. And at the same time, I also thank you so much for all our participants and audience to join in from different parts of the world. And we also wish you all was safe and healthy. So hopefully we will see every one of you next time. So thank you so much. Take care.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you. Thank you.
Thank you for inviting us.